The air inside the gilded scepter was not merely conditioned, it was curated. It tasted of old money and freshly shaved truffles, a thick, silent atmosphere that muffled the distant sounds of New York City into a forgettable hum. Crystal chandeliers, vast and intricate as frozen constellations, hung from a ceiling so high it seemed to belong to another, more celestial, realm. Each table was an island of power, shrouded in pools of soft, strategic light, where men and women with quiet voices and laser-focused eyes moved billions of dollars between the appetizer and the main course. The clinking of heavy silver cutlery against bespoke porcelain was the only percussion in this symphony of wealth, a delicate sound that belied the brutal finality of the deals being made. In this world, everything had a price, and everyone had a role. For the patrons, it was to command. For the staff, it was to be invisible, to move through the spaces between these islands like silent, efficient ghosts, anticipating needs before they were spoken, their presence felt but never truly seen. This was a stage, and every night, the same grand play of power and influence was performed with flawless precision. Hilaire Vance moved through this gilded theater with a grace born of exhaustion and necessity. Her uniform, a simple black dress with a crisp white apron, was a costume of subservience, designed to blend into the shadows cast by the opulent decor. To the casual observer, she was just another part of the restaurant's seamless function, her face a polite, neutral mask, her movements economical and precise. But beneath the surface of the competent waitress, a different mind was at work. As she refilled a water glass with a steady hand, her brain was not on the vintage of the wine or the temperature of the steak. It was tracing the intricate patterns of a Florentine astrolabe, deciphering the coded language of Renaissance symbologists, a world away from the cold transactions surrounding her. Her PhD in art history from Yale felt like a life lived by someone else, a dream from which she had been violently awakened. Now that brilliant mind, once celebrated in academic circles, was occupied with calculating tips and managing the crushing weight of medical bills that piled up like relentless snowdrifts, threatening to bury her completely. Each smile she offered was a shield, hiding the silent, grinding grief for a life stolen and a father lost in the fog of illness. The image of her father was a constant, haunting presence in the back of her mind, a ghost that sat at every table she served. She could see him not as he was now, lying still in a sterile room at the Mount Sinai Neurological Institute, his world reduced to the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor and the sterile scent of antiseptic, but as he had been. A man whose eyes held the fire of 1,000 libraries, whose hands, now limp and unresponsive, had once been able to coax secrets from ancient manuscripts. His stroke had been a thief in the night, stealing his voice, his memories, his very essence. It was a direct consequence, the doctors had said, of immense prolonged stress. The stress of losing everything. Their family's legacy, a small but respected archival firm built over generations, had been devoured whole in a predatory corporate takeover, a fraudulent case of asset stripping that had left them with nothing but debt and a name erased from the ledgers of history. Ilara worked these double shifts, her body aching and her spirit worn thin, for him. Every dollar she earned was a small piece of dignity she could buy back for him, a moment of comfort in the unending twilight of his condition. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of New York City, but first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below, and be sure to subscribe to join our community. You're about to witness an incredible story of resilience. As we get started, drop your city or country in the comments, and if you're not subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to do it so you're always here for stories like this. The world of the Gilded Scepter is about to be shattered by a truth it is not prepared to hear, and a power it has foolishly underestimated. The players are taking their seats, and the first move is about to be made. The arrival of Alistair Finch was not an entrance, it was an occupation. The carefully curated atmosphere of the restaurant seemed to bend around him, the low hum of conversation dipping perceptibly as he swept through the main dining room. He didn't walk so much as advance, his shoulders squared in a bespoke suit of sharkskin gray that probably cost more than Alara's annual salary. He moved with the effortless entitlement of a man who had never been told no, his gaze sweeping across the room not with interest but with appraisal, as if he were inspecting a property he was considering buying and demolishing. He handed his overcoat to the maître d', without making eye contact, a dismissive gesture that conveyed with perfect clarity that the person receiving it was no more significant than the coat rack itself. There was a chill that radiated from him, an aura of cold, calculating power that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He was the CEO of Finch Global Acquisitions, a name synonymous with ruthless takeovers and the methodical dismantling of smaller, family-owned companies. He was a titan of industry, a predator at the apex of the food chain, and this restaurant was his personal hunting ground. Alara felt the shift in the room's energy long before she saw him. It was a familiar tension, the collective intake of breath that accompanied the arrival of true, predatory power. She was assigned to his section, a private alcove shrouded in deep velvet curtains that offered the illusion of privacy. Alistair was entertaining a potential investor, a man who looked visibly nervous in the CEO's formidable presence. Alistair spoke in a low, confident tone, his words punctuated by the quiet, assured gestures of a man accustomed to absolute authority. Alara approached the table, her professional mask firmly in place, ready to take their drink order. As she leaned in slightly, the delicate necklace she wore, usually hidden beneath her collar, swung forward, catching a stray beam of light. It was a peculiar piece, a series of interlocking bronze and silver rings around a small dark stone, covered in what looked like tiny, intricate scratches. Alistair's monologue on market futures faltered, his cold, gray eyes, which had previously looked straight through her, now fixed upon the object hanging from her neck. A slow, cruel smile spread across his lips as he saw an opportunity, a perfect prop for the point he was about to make. He raised a hand, not to wave her away, but to stop her, to hold her in place like a specimen under a microscope. His voice, though not loud, cut through the hushed ambiance of the alcove, sharp and clear. "One moment," he said, his eyes still locked on the necklace. He turned to his guest, a theatrical flourish in his gesture. "You see, this is a perfect example of what I was talking about. Perception versus reality. Value versus sentiment." He then looked back at Alara, his gaze dripping with a condescending pity that was far more insulting than outright anger. "Tell me," he began, his voice laced with mock curiosity, "where does one acquire such a unique piece? A street fair, perhaps?" He let the question hang in the air, designed to humiliate, to reduce her to a caricature of the working poor. He didn't wait for an answer. He leaned back, addressing his guest again, but ensuring Alara was the target. "It's a tacky trinket a child might make, a piece of worthless scrap metal. People cling to these things, these sentimental objects, believing they have meaning, but they have no real value, no history, no provenance." As Alistair's words washed over her, a fury unlike anything she had ever known, cold and silent, began to solidify in Alara's veins. It was not a hot, explosive rage, but a glacial hardening of her resolve. Each condescending syllable, each dismissive sneer, was a physical blow, but it wasn't the insult to her taste or her station that ignited this fire, it was the desecration of a memory. In her mind's eye, the opulent restaurant dissolved, replaced by the warm, dusty light of her father's study. She saw his hands, strong and sure, holding this very necklace. He was explaining it to a younger version of herself, his voice filled with passion and a quiet pride. "This isn't just jewelry, Alara," he had said, his finger tracing the strange symbols. "This is our story. This is our map. It's a key, not made of metal, but of knowledge. It holds everything we are." Alistair's insult wasn't just directed at a piece of metal. It was an attack on the last sacred piece of her father she had left. It was an assault on their story, on their very existence. The waitress, the invisible ghost of the gilded scepter, began to recede, and deep within her, the historian, the symbologist, the daughter of a ruined legacy, began to awaken. Alistair, drunk on his own arrogance and completely oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed, pressed on, using the moment to further inflate his own importance. He gestured vaguely at the necklace, then waved his hand around the restaurant, a grand, sweeping motion meant to encompass the world of true wealth. The truly wealthy, the families with real legacy, he lectured, his voice taking on the pedantic tone of a professor. We don't concern ourselves with sentiment. We seek out objects of tangible, historical power, artifacts, relics. He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with a possessive fire. My family, for instance, has been searching for nearly a century for a single object known as the Vance key, a lost relic, a masterpiece of 19th-century craftsmanship, rumored to unlock the legendary Vance treasury. Now that, my friend, is true value. An object that holds not just a fortune, but a dynasty within its mechanisms. He was so lost in his own narrative, so blinded by his obsession, that he failed to notice the change that had come over the waitress standing before him. He concluded his performance with a final, dismissive flick of his eyes toward Alara's chest. Unlike this piece of scrap, he said, the words landing with the finality of a judge's gavel. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the unspoken discomfort of his guest, and the quiet indignation of the woman he had just publicly dissected. He expected her to scurry away, shamed and broken, as all people of her station were supposed to do. He expected her to be invisible again. But Alara did not move. She remained perfectly still, her posture unchanged, her hands steady at her sides. The ambient sounds of the restaurant seemed to fade into nothingness, the entire world shrinking to the confines of this velvet-draped alcove. The air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with billion-dollar deals, and everything to do with a history that was about to be unearthed. The humiliation was complete, the line had been crossed, and Alistair Finch, a man who believed he controlled everything in his world, had just made the single greatest mistake of his life, setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to his own spectacular ruin. For a long moment, the world held its breath. The air in the alcove, once thick with the scent of truffle oil and arrogance, now felt thin and sharp, charged with an electric tension. Alistair Finch's final dismissive words, this piece of scrap, hung in the space between them, a monument to his own hubris. He expected a flinch, a bowed head, the hurried retreat of a shamed servant. He anticipated the quiet rustle of her uniform as she scurried away, her humiliation, a satisfying dessert to his performance of power. What he did not expect was the stillness. Alara Vance did not move. She did not breathe. She simply stood there, a statue carved from compressed silence, her eyes, once professionally vacant, now fixed on him with an intensity that was utterly unnerving. It was not a look of anger, or fear, or sadness. It was the look of a scientist observing a specimen just before beginning a dissection. The polite mask of the waitress had not just cracked. It had disintegrated, revealing something ancient and formidable beneath. Inside Alara, the world had slowed to the deliberate rhythmic tick of a grand clock. The glacial fury that had begun as a cold seed in her stomach now bloomed into a crystalline structure of pure, unadulterated resolve, encasing her heart in a protective sheath of ice. Her pulse, which should have been hammering against her ribs, instead grew slow and steady, each beat a measured drum signaling a call to arms. Her breath, which should have been shallow with anxiety, deepened, becoming a controlled, circular flow of energy that cleared the fog of servitude from her mind. The humiliation was no longer a wound. It was a whetstone, sharpening the edges of her intellect to a razor's point. Every condescending word Alistair had spoken echoed in her memory, not as an insult, but as a piece of data, a variable in an equation that was rapidly solving itself in the silent, powerful corridors of her mind. She was no longer Alara Vance, Waitress. She was Elara Vance, daughter of a historian, keeper of a legacy, and the last living soul who knew the language of the key. The opulent velvet and crystal of the gilded scepter melted away, replaced by the warm amber light of her father's study. She could smell the familiar scent of aging paper, leather bindings, and the faint, sweet aroma of his pipe tobacco. She saw his hands, not frail and trembling in a hospital bed, but strong and deft, turning the very necklace Alistair had just mocked. His voice, a gentle baritone filled with a scholar's passion, filled her memory. He had told her that the key was not just an object but a promise, a testament to their family's belief that knowledge was the only true, unassailable wealth. It was a physical manifestation of their history, each symbol a chapter, each mechanism a verse. To call it a tacky trinket was to call their entire lineage worthless, to spit on the grave of every artisan who had come before her. In that moment the weight of generations settled upon her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a mantle of power. Her father's stolen voice became her own. She finally blinked, a slow, deliberate motion that severed the last thread of her subservient role. She gently placed the polished silver water pitcher she was holding onto the service tray, the soft clink of metal on metal sounding like a gavel in the profound silence. She straightened to her full height, a subtle shift in posture that seemed to add inches to her stature. Her hands, which had spent the evening clearing plates and folding napkins, now moved with the precision of a master craftsman. Alistair watched, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face, irritated by this delay, this inexplicable refusal to simply vanish. He opened his mouth to deliver a sharp, final dismissal, to command her to leave his sight, but the words died on his lips. Elara had raised her head, and her eyes, now clear and focused, met his directly for the very first time. There was no deference in them, no fear. There was only a calm, chilling certainty that made the hairs on Alistair's arms stand on end. Her voice, when it came, was nothing like the polite, unobtrusive murmur of a waitress. It was clear, calm, and carried a weight that seemed to absorb all other sound in the room. It was the voice of a lecturer addressing a room of students, a voice of absolute authority. "This trinket," she began, the words perfectly enunciated, each syllable a polished stone dropped into a still pond, "is not a replica, Mr. Finch. It is a 19th century chronometer key, a compound astrolabe designed with a level of mechanical complexity that your finest modern watchmakers would struggle to replicate." She paused, letting the technical precision of her statement hang in the air, a stark contrast to his clumsy, dismissive insults. Alistair's guest, who had been looking down at his plate in acute discomfort, now looked up, his eyes wide, with a mixture of shock and intrigue. The power dynamic in the alcove had just been fundamentally and irrevocably altered. Alistair stared at her, his mind struggling to process the information. The words were preposterous, an absurd fantasy coming from the mouth of a nobody. Yet, the confidence with which she spoke, the sheer, unshakable certainty in her tone, planted a seed of doubt in his mind. He was about to laugh, to call for the manager, and have her thrown out for her insolence, but she continued, her voice never wavering. "It was crafted in the Vance workshop, circa 1888. The name hit Alistair like a physical blow. Vance. The name from his family's oldest, most frustrating ledgers. The name of the company his grandfather had acquired. The name of the treasury he had spent a fortune trying to locate. A cold dread, slick and oily, began to seep into his consciousness. It was impossible. A coincidence. It had to be. But his eyes were drawn back to the necklace, no longer seeing a piece of junk, but trying to decipher its intricate, alien patterns. Elara saw the flicker of recognition, the sudden terror behind his arrogant facade, and she pressed her advantage, her voice becoming even more precise, more cutting. "And the symbols you find so tacky," she continued, a faint, almost imperceptible edge of steel entering her tone, "are not random scratches. They form a celestial lock, a cipher keyed to the meridian alignment of the vernal equinox of the year the workshop was founded. It is a language, Mr. Finch. A language of astronomy, metallurgy, and history. A language your family has clearly forgotten how to speak. With a practiced, fluid motion that was both elegant and unnervingly swift, she brought her fingers to the necklace. Alistair's guest leaned forward, completely captivated, as if watching a magician perform an impossible trick. The entire world of the Gilded Scepter, with its hushed deals and silent power plays, had ceased to exist outside this single, velvet-draped stage. Her thumb and forefinger found specific, almost invisible notches on the outer rings of the device. With a deft twist to the left and a slight pressure inward, a movement she had practiced 1,000 times under her father's watchful eye, something extraordinary happened. There was a soft, satisfying click, a sound of perfectly machined, century-old metal sliding into place. The solid-looking pendant fractured into a series of hidden, concentric rings, which spun silently into a new alignment, revealing a second layer of even more intricate symbols beneath. A faint, golden light seemed to emanate from its core, catching the candlelight and fracturing it into a dozen tiny rainbows. It was no longer a necklace. It had transformed into a complex, beautiful instrument, a key of breathtaking ingenuity. It was a work of art, a marvel of science, and a direct refutation of everything Alistair had just proclaimed. Alistair Finch made a sound, a choked, guttural gasp that was torn from the depths of his being. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a waxy, pallid gray. His carefully constructed mask of bored superiority shattered into a million pieces, revealing the raw, desperate obsession that had fueled his life. He recognized it. Not from a photograph, but from the detailed hand-drawn diagrams his grandfather had kept locked in the family vault. Diagrams he had studied for countless nights, memorizing every line, every gear, every impossible angle. He had always believed them to be theoretical, a blueprint for a device that was never actually created or had been lost to time. But here it was. Real. Functional. Hanging around the neck of a waitress he had just publicly eviscerated. The Vance key. The object of a century-long hunt, the missing piece of his family's legacy, was right in front of him. The shock was immediately followed by a wave of pure, unadulterated rage. It was a volcanic fury, born of profound humiliation and the terror of being so utterly publicly wrong. That this woman, this insignificant, invisible servant, not only possessed the key but understood it, was an intolerable affront to his entire existence. She had made a fool of him in front of an important investor. She had exposed his ignorance. She held the one thing in the world he wanted more than anything else, and she had done it with a quiet, devastating grace that only amplified his own boorishness. His mind, usually a cold, calculating machine, was now a maelstrom of white-hot anger. He had to regain control. He had to crush her. He had to possess that key. His face, once pale with shock, now became a mask of crimson fury, his lips pulling back from his teeth in a silent snarl. "You're fired!" He spat, the words sharp and venomous. He didn't even look at Alara, instead turning his furious gaze toward the main dining room, searching for the manager. "Manager!" he bellowed, his voice echoing through the restaurant, shattering the carefully curated piece. Conversations halted, heads turned. The patrons, men and women who valued discretion above all else, stared at his table, their expressions a mixture of surprise and disapproval. Alistair didn't care. He was a wounded animal, lashing out with all the power he could command. He stood up, knocking his chair backward with a loud crash. This woman," he said, pointing a trembling finger at Alara, "was attempting to extort me. She was harassing my guest. I want her out of here, now." The lie was clumsy, transparent, but it was backed by the full weight of his wealth and influence. The restaurant manager, a man named Julian whose entire career was built on placating men like Alistair Finch, scurried over, his face a mask of professional panic. He saw the scene. His most important client, incandescent with rage, A waitress standing with an unnerving calm and a priceless wine glass overturned on the table. He didn't need to know the details. The customer was always right, especially when that customer's annual spending could cover the restaurant's entire payroll for a month. "Mr. Finch, my deepest apologies. I will handle this immediately," he said, his voice a low, placating murmur. He turned to Alara, his eyes pleading with her not to make things worse. "Miss Vance, please, come with me," he whispered, gesturing toward the staff exit. He avoided looking at her, his shame palpable. He knew this was wrong, but he was trapped, a pawn in a game far above his pay grade. Alara showed no emotion. She had expected this. It was the predictable, brutish response of a man whose power was built on money, not intellect. As Julian gently tried to guide her away, she took one last look at Alistair. He was staring at her, his eyes burning with a possessive, predatory fire that was focused entirely on the key resting against her collarbone. As she was escorted away from the table, his voice, low and menacing, cut through the air, meant only for her. "That necklace belongs to me," he snarled. A threat and a promise rolled into one. Alara didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had already won this battle. She had drawn the beast out of its lair, confirmed its identity, and seen its weakness. Its weakness was obsession. As she walked through the dining room, feeling the curious and judgmental stares of the wealthy patrons on her back, she felt no shame. She felt only the cold, clear thrill of a plan beginning to take shape. The heavy oak door of the Gilded Scepter closed behind her, and the sudden shock of the cool New York night air felt like a baptism. The muffled sounds of the city, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of a passing subway rushed in to fill the silence. For a moment, standing on the pristine sidewalk under the restaurant's golden awning, the reality of her situation hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had just been fired. Her only source of income, the lifeline that paid for her father's care, was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up her throat. The mountain of medical bills loomed in her mind, an insurmountable peak. For a fleeting second, despair washed over her, a dark, heavy tide, threatening to pull her under. She could have just stayed silent. She could have swallowed the humiliation, as she had done 1,000 times before, and she would still have a job. But then her fingers instinctively closed around the cool, intricate metal of the key. She held it in her palm, its familiar weight, a grounding force in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. The panic receded, replaced by the same icy resolve that had filled her in the restaurant. This was not a defeat. It was a declaration of war. For years, she had been a victim of a crime she couldn't prove, haunted by a faceless corporation that had destroyed her family. Tonight, the monster had given her its name, Finch. The humiliation she had endured was not a random act of cruelty. It was the final, arrogant flourish of a generational crime. The man who had mocked her father's legacy was the heir to the man who had destroyed it. The knowledge didn't break her, it forged her. It transformed her grief into fuel and her quiet resistance into a burning, focused mission. She began to walk, her steps no longer the tired shuffle of an exhausted waitress, but the determined, rhythmic pace of a soldier marching toward the front lines. The glittering lights of Fifth Avenue blurred around her, unseen. Her mind, a powerful engine finally engaged, was already working, processing, strategizing. The key was more than a link to her past, it was the weapon for her future. Her father had always told her it held more than just their story. He had hinted at a final layer of secrets, a purpose he had not yet revealed to her. Now, she understood. Alistair Finch's desperate, obsessive need for the key told her everything. It wasn't just about a lost treasure. It was about something he needed to keep hidden, something that could threaten his entire empire. The truth. The key didn't just unlock a vault. It unlocked the evidence of the original crime. Her small, book-filled apartment was a world away from the opulent prison of the Gilded Scepter. Here, she was not invisible. Here, she was surrounded by the tools of her true trade, towering stacks of books on cryptography, Renaissance art, and historical metallurgy. The air smelled of old paper and dust, the scent of knowledge. She shed the black uniform, the costume of her servitude, and let it fall to the floor like a discarded skin. She was no longer playing a part. She was herself again, fully and completely. She sat at her cluttered wooden desk, the Vance key placed carefully before her, under the warm glow of a reading lamp. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a silent challenge. For the first time in years, the scholar within her, the brilliant mind that had been praised at Yale, was fully awake and hungry. She knew she couldn't do this alone. Deciphering the final layer of the key would require resources she no longer had access to: spectral analysis equipment, archival databases, and scholarly collaboration. There was only one person she could trust. One person who understood the intersection of history, art, and justice. She picked up her phone, her fingers scrolling through the contacts until they found the name: Professor Alistair Blackwood. Her former mentor at Yale, a man whose passion for historical preservation was matched only by his contempt for corporate vultures who treated history as a commodity. He had been devastated when she'd had to drop out of her PhD program, and he had always suspected there was more to her family's story of financial collapse. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before he answered, his voice a familiar, gravelly rumble. "Elara? Is everything all right?" He sounded concerned, his sharp mind immediately sensing that this was not a casual call. Elara didn't waste time with pleasantries. Her voice was steady, imbued with a newfound purpose. "Professor," she said, "I need your help. I know who did it. I know who destroyed my family." She then proceeded to recount the entire evening, from Alistair Finch's arrogant monologue to the transformation of the key and her subsequent firing. She explained her theory, that the key was the only thing that could prove the original fraud committed by Alistair's grandfather. She left nothing out, her words painting a vivid, damning picture of the events that had just transpired. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. For a heart-stopping moment, Elara feared he wouldn't believe her, that he would dismiss it as a wild, grief-fueled fantasy. But when he finally spoke, his voice was not filled with doubt, but with a grim, righteous anger. "Elara," he said, the sound resonating with quiet power, "I've been waiting for this call for 5 years. Reginald Finch was a known pirate in preservation circles, but no one could ever make the charges stick. He covered his tracks too well." He paused, and she could hear the sound of pages turning in the background, the rustle of a scholar preparing for battle. "Bring the key to the university first thing in the morning. We'll use the conservation lab. If there's a secret hidden in that metal, we will find it. This isn't just about your family anymore, Elara. This is about setting history straight." The hunt had officially begun. The next morning, Elara walked onto the hallowed grounds of the Yale campus, not as a former student shadowed by failure, but as a researcher embarking on the most important project of her life. The weight of the key, hidden safely beneath her coat, felt different now. It was no longer just a memento of a lost world, but a tangible piece of the future she was determined to reclaim. Professor Blackwood met her at the entrance to the art history department, his eyes sharp and focused, his handshake firm and reassuring. He was a man in his late 60s, with a wild mane of white hair and an energy that belied his age. He led her past lecture halls and student lounges, down into the quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary of the university's Artifact Conservation Laboratory, a place where the secrets of the past were carefully and methodically brought into the light. The lab was a stark, sterile environment, filled with gleaming stainless steel tables, powerful microscopes, and machines designed for X-ray fluorescence and carbon dating. It was a world of pure, empirical fact, a place where sentiment and arrogance held no currency. Here, the truth was all that mattered. Professor Blackwood, with the reverence of a priest handling a holy relic, placed the Vance key under a high-resolution digital microscope. On a large monitor, the intricate symbols, invisible to the naked eye, were magnified 1,000 times, revealing a breathtaking level of detail. They were not just symbols, they were a tapestry of microscopic gears, levers, and astronomical charts, a hidden world of information locked within the artifact's design. This was a language that only a Vance could truly speak, and Alara was ready to translate. For hours they worked, a seamless partnership of mentor and protege. Alara, drawing on the deep, ingrained knowledge her father had passed down, began to decipher the primary sequence of the celestial lock. She explained how each symbol corresponded not just to a star, but to a specific date and a corresponding financial transaction in her family's history. It was a mnemonic device, a way of encoding their entire business legacy into a single beautiful object. The professor, meanwhile, used the lab's equipment to analyze the metallurgical composition of the key, discovering that different alloys were used in specific parts of the inner mechanism, creating a subtle magnetic signature that was itself another layer of the code. It was a lock-and-key system of staggering genius, designed to protect a secret for generations. As they peeled back the layers of the puzzle, a sense of urgency began to build. Alara knew that Alistair Finch would not be idle. A man that obsessed, that powerful, would already be mobilizing his vast resources to find her and seize the key. He would use private investigators, lawyers, and any other tool of intimidation at his disposal. This was a race against time. Every moment they spent in the lab was a moment Alistair was using to close in on her. The quiet, academic pursuit had transformed into a high-stakes investigation, with the soul of her family's legacy hanging in the balance. The pressure was immense, but it only served to sharpen her focus, to drive her deeper into the intricate heart of the puzzle her ancestors had left for her. Finally, late into the afternoon, they reached the final layer. It was a sequence of numbers, micro-engraved on the innermost ring of the key, a ring that was only visible when the celestial lock was aligned to a specific, obscure stellar configuration. At first, the numbers seemed random, a meaningless string of digits. But Alara, remembering a story her father had once told her about the founding of their company, had a sudden, brilliant flash of insight. "It's not a code," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "It's a location, a vault number, and a password." She cross-referenced the numbers with old New York City archival maps on the lab's computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard. And then, she found it. A private, long-forgotten safe deposit vault registered under a pseudonym in a small, independent bank in the old financial district. A bank that had, miraculously, never been acquired by a larger corporation. But it was the next discovery that made the air leave her lungs. The password, a combination of letters and numbers derived from the key's astronomical data, unlocked the bank's digital registry for the vault. On the screen, a single, time-stamped document appeared, the access log. And there, listed as the primary account holder, was not a name from her family, but a name that made her blood run cold. Reginald Finch. Her enemy's grandfather. He had found the vault, he had known where it was, but the log showed only one entry, his initial attempt to open it, dated nearly 60 years ago. And next to it, a single, damning word, failed. He had the location, but he did not have the key. He had never been able to get inside. The secret was still safe. Professor Blackwood placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of academic excitement and righteous fury. "He couldn't open it," the professor said, his voice low with astonishment. "My God, Alara, your family outsmarted him. They built a fortress he could never breach." The realization washed over Alara, a wave of profound, empowering clarity. Her ancestors had known that a day like this might come. They had anticipated that a predator like Reginald Finch might one day appear. They had not just built a vault to protect their wealth. They had built a trap, a time capsule of truth, waiting for the one person with the right knowledge to finally open it. And that person was her. The key was not just a tool to unlock a door, it was an inheritance of responsibility. The contents of that vault, she now knew with absolute certainty, were more valuable than gold or jewels. It would hold the proof. The original, unaltered ledgers, the forged documents, the evidence of the fraud that had allowed Reginald Finch to build his empire on the ruins of her family's name. It was the smoking gun, the irrefutable evidence that could bring the entire Finch dynasty crashing down. The fight was no longer just about restoring her father's dignity or reclaiming a lost fortune. It was about exposing a foundational lie that had persisted for generations. It was about justice, pure and simple. The fear she had felt on the sidewalk the night before was a distant memory, a ghost of a person she no longer was. In its place was a cold, hard certainty. She looked at the professor, her eyes burning with a new fire. "He's hosting a charity gala next month," she said, her mind already leaping ahead, formulating the next phase of the plan, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, to unveil his new Finch collection of historical artifacts. The press will be there. The entire city's elite will be there. The professor's eyes widened as he understood her intention. It was audacious. It was dangerous. It was perfect. This would not be a quiet, legal battle fought in stuffy courtrooms over years of appeals. This would be a public execution, a trial held in the court of public opinion, with the entire world watching. Alistair Finch had used a public stage to humiliate her. She would use a public stage to dismantle him. The decision was made. The path forward was clear. The next few weeks would be a frantic, dangerous race to access the vault, retrieve the evidence, and prepare for the final confrontation. Alara knew that Alistair's investigators would be hunting for her, that every step she took would be shadowed by the immense power of the Finch Empire. But she was no longer alone. She had her mentor, she had the truth, and she had the key. She was not just a waitress seeking revenge. She was a historian reclaiming the narrative, a daughter honoring her father, and the living embodiment of a legacy that had refused to be erased. She picked up the Vance key from the examination table, its metal warm against her skin, and closed her hand around it. It felt like a heart, beating in time with her own, ready for the battle to come. As Ilara and the professor began to meticulously plan their next steps, mapping out the logistics of accessing a 60-year-old vault and preparing the evidence for a dramatic reveal, Alistair Finch was in his own sanctuary of power. His office, a vast expanse of glass and steel overlooking Central Park from the 70th floor, was a monument to his own success. But today, the spectacular view brought him no comfort. He paced the floor like a caged panther, his bespoke suit feeling like a straitjacket, his mind replaying the scene in the restaurant over and over again. The image of the waitress, her calm, authoritative voice, the impossible transformation of the necklace, it was a loop of humiliation that fueled his rage to a fever pitch. He had been made to look like a fool, an ignorant buffoon, and he would not see the irony in his chosen battlefield. He saw only a stage upon which he could reassert his dominance and erase the memory of his humiliation. He picked up his phone and dialed a number from a secure, encrypted line. The man who answered did not have a name, only a reputation. He was a fixer, a ghost who moved through the digital and physical worlds with equal terrifying efficiency, a specialist in making problems and people disappear. Alistair's voice was devoid of its earlier rage, now a low, flat instrument of command. He described Ilara, her last known address, her academic background. He described the key. His instructions were simple and chillingly precise. Find her, acquire the key, use any means necessary, but leave no trace that would lead back to Finch Global. The hunt had begun not with a roar but with a quiet, lethal whisper. Ilara knew the clock was ticking. The quiet sanctuary of the university lab felt like the eye of a hurricane, a temporary calm before the storm of Alistair's retaliation. Professor Blackwood, using his extensive network of contacts, had already put out feelers, discreet inquiries into the corporate history of Finch Global. He knew that brute force would be useless against an empire built on shadows and legal firewalls. They needed a guide, an insider who knew the secret pathways of that corrupt kingdom. The response came sooner than they expected, a cryptic email from a name Blackwood recognized with a start, Marcus Thorne. Thorne had been the lead archivist at a historical society that Finch Global had acquired and gutted a decade earlier. He had been a vocal opponent of the takeover, a man who had tried to fight, and had been professionally and personally destroyed for his efforts. He had lost everything, but he had not lost his memory or his hatred for the Finch dynasty. He was the perfect ally, a ghost from Alistair's corporate past, hungry for a chance at redemption. They met in a place of ghosts, the dusty, forgotten basement archives of the New York Public Library, a labyrinth of rolling shelves and the quiet, pervasive scent of decaying paper. Marcus Thorne was a man who seemed to be fading into the background, his shoulders stooped, his eyes holding the weary caution of a long-hunted animal. But as Alara laid out the plan, as she showed him the Vance key and explained what it could unlock, a spark ignited in those tired eyes. He listened intently, his head nodding slowly, the pieces of a puzzle he had been staring at for 10 years finally clicking into place. He had seen the irregularities in the ledgers back then, the subtle forgeries and backdated documents, but he had never had the original source material to prove it. He had been dismissed as a disgruntled employee, a conspiracy theorist. Now the proof was within reach. He agreed to help without a moment's hesitation, his voice a low, determined whisper. His first contribution was a piece of critical intelligence, the name of the small, independent bank, and the precise protocols for accessing its pre-war safe deposit vaults. The journey to the Argent Trust and Savings Bank felt like a descent into another era. The building was a relic of old New York, a narrow, granite-faced structure squeezed between two gleaming glass skyscrapers, a stubborn holdout against the relentless march of modernity. Its lobby was a time capsule of polished brass, dark mahogany, and worn marble floors. The air was still and cool, carrying the faint, metallic scent of old money and secrets. Alara, dressed in a conservative business suit borrowed from a friend, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, approached the front desk, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was no longer Alara Vance, the waitress. She was portraying a junior associate from a historical preservation trust, a role she and the professor had rehearsed for days. She presented the paperwork they had meticulously forged, a legal request to access a dormant family trust for archival purposes. Every detail had to be perfect, every signature authentic, every word she spoke imbued with a confidence she did not feel. The bank manager, a stern elderly man with eyes that had seen everything, scrutinized the documents, his silence stretching for an agonizing eternity. Inside, Alara's mind was a whirlwind. The image of her father in his hospital bed flashed before her eyes, his still form a constant reminder of what was at stake. She could feel the weight of the key, hidden in a secret pocket inside her blazer, a cold, hard promise against her skin. She focused on her breathing, slowing it down, channeling the icy resolve she had discovered in the restaurant. This was a performance, and her life's work had prepared her for it. She was a historian, an expert in provenance and authenticity. She could speak the language of archives and legal deeds with a fluency that was not faked. She answered the manager's sharp, probing questions with a calm, academic precision, citing obscure preservation laws and historical precedents, burying him in a landslide of information that was both impressive and slightly overwhelming. She saw the flicker of respect in his eyes, the slight relaxing of his shoulders. He was a guardian of old traditions, and she was speaking his language. He finally stamped the papers with a heavy, satisfying thud and handed her a key, not to the vault itself, but to the antechamber that led to the lower levels. The first gate had been opened. She was led down a narrow, winding staircase, the polished mahogany giving way to cold, painted concrete. The air grew cooler, heavier, thick with the smell of damp earth and aging steel. The vault area was a cavern of silence, the only sound the soft hum of a dehumidifier and the echo of their footsteps. The manager led her to a massive steel door, its surface covered in a complex array of gears and locking mechanisms that looked more like the entrance to a pharaoh's tomb than a bank vault. He explained that this was as far as he could go. The inner vaults were self-contained units, accessible only by those who held the specific, corresponding keys. He pointed her toward a specific section, a wall of burnished steel deposit boxes, each bearing a small, engraved number plate. He then retreated, his footsteps fading up the staircase, leaving her alone in the profound, echoing silence of the underground chamber. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that seemed to press in on her from all sides. For a moment, the sheer weight of the history contained in this room, the countless secrets locked away behind these steel doors, was overwhelming. Her hands trembled slightly as she walked toward the designated box. The number, micro-engraved on the key, now gleamed back at her from a small brass plate. 1888. The year the workshop was founded. It was here, the final piece of the puzzle. She stood before the small, unassuming steel door, the culmination of her family's entire history, the final testament of their legacy. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she removed the Vance key from her pocket. It felt strangely warm in the cool air of the vault, almost alive. She remembered her father's lessons, the long afternoons spent in his study as he guided her fingers over the key's mechanisms, teaching her the precise sequence of twists and turns. It was a dance she had known her whole life, a muscle memory ingrained in her very being. She inserted the key into the lock. It slid in with a smooth, perfect click, a sound that seemed to echo through a century of silence. With a series of deft, practiced movements, she manipulated the key's outer and inner rings, aligning the celestial symbols with the lock's internal tumblers. Each click of the mechanism was a heartbeat, a step closer to the truth. There was a final, resonant thud as the last tumbler fell into place. She turned the key, and with a low, groaning sound of metal on metal, the heavy steel door swung inward, releasing a puff of stale, dry air that smelled of paper, ink, and time itself. Her breath caught in her throat. The inside of the safe deposit box was not filled with gold or jewels, as the Finch family had long imagined. It was filled with knowledge. Neatly stacked and bound in oilcloth were several thick, leather-bound ledgers, a series of rolled vellum deeds, and a single sealed envelope addressed in her great-grandfather's elegant looping script. The name on the envelope was not addressed to anyone in particular. It simply read, "To the keeper of the key." With reverent hands, she lifted the first ledger. The leather was cool and smooth beneath her fingertips. As she opened it, the pages crackled softly, a sound like autumn leaves. The book fell open to a page of meticulous, hand-drawn entries, detailing the company's finances from its founding year. The ink was still dark, the handwriting clear and strong. She recognized her father's annotations in the margins, notes he must have made years ago, when he had last inspected these documents, before the world had come crashing down around them. It was the original, unaltered record of their family's business, a pristine and irrefutable account of their history. It was the baseline, the control group against which all forgeries could be measured. A wave of emotion, a mixture of grief and profound, triumphant joy, washed over her. This was her family's soul, preserved and waiting for her. She then unrolled one of the vellum deeds. It was the original land grant for the property where the Vance workshop had stood for over a century. Her eyes scanned the familiar legal language, the detailed property lines, the official seals. And then she saw it. Tucked into the bottom corner, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, was a watermark, a complex, intricate design of a sextant, interwoven with a star chart. It was the Vance family's private seal, a mark of authenticity they embedded into all their most important documents. She remembered her father explaining it to her, how the specific pattern of the stars in the watermark corresponded to the date the document was signed, a cryptographic signature that was impossible to forge without the original embossing plate. Her heart began to beat faster. This was the weapon she had been searching for. Next, she picked up a different set of documents, which Marcus Thorne had told her to look for. These were the acquisition papers, the ones Reginald Finch had filed to take control of the Vance assets. On the surface, they looked perfect, the legal language ironclad. But when she held the page up to the faint light of the vault, her blood ran cold. There was no watermark. It was a forgery. A brilliant one, but a forgery nonetheless. Reginald Finch had managed to replicate the letterhead, the signatures, even the specific type of aged paper, but he had not known about the secret watermark. He had built his empire on a lie, and she was now holding the physical proof of his original sin in her hands. The scale of the deception, the sheer cold-blooded audacity of it, left her breathless. This was not just a corporate takeover, it was the calculated erasure of a family's entire existence. Finally, with trembling fingers, she opened the sealed envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter from her great-grandfather. It was not a letter of anger or despair, but of foresight and resolve. He wrote of a growing darkness in the world of business, of predators who saw history not as something to be preserved but as a resource to be plundered. He explained that he had created this vault not just to protect their assets, but to protect their truth. He wrote that the key was not just a tool, but a test of character and knowledge, ensuring that only a true heir, one who valued their history above all else, could ever access it. The final lines of the letter burned themselves into her memory. Let this knowledge not be a sword for vengeance, but a light for justice. Honor our name not by destroying another's, but by rebuilding our own. In that moment, her mission crystallized. This was not about revenge, it was about restoration. As Alara carefully packed the evidence into a secure briefcase, a different kind of hunt was escalating on the streets above. Alistair's fixer, a man named Corbin, was a digital phantom of terrifying skill. He had moved through the city's digital infrastructure with surgical precision, bypassing privacy laws and data protection with a few elegant lines of code. He had pulled Alara's financial records, her phone logs, her academic transcripts. He had flagged her recent communication with Professor Blackwood. He had accessed the university's security camera footage, watching her enter the conservation lab with a small, intriguing object in her possession. He didn't know what it was, but he knew it was the target. He was methodical, patient, and completely without morals. He was now tracking the professor's movements, knowing that sooner or later he would lead him to Alara. The net was closing, the digital breadcrumbs forming a clear and undeniable path. Corbin's investigation led him to Marcus Thorne. He uncovered the records of Thorne's wrongful dismissal, the public crusade he had waged against Finch Global, the subsequent blacklisting that had ruined his career. It was a clear motive for collaboration. Corbin's algorithms began to cross-reference Thorne's known associates and locations with Blackwood's recent activities. A pattern began to emerge, a convergence of data points that all seemed to lead toward the old financial district. He didn't have the exact location yet, but he had narrowed the search grid to a few square blocks. He dispatched a small team of discreet surveillance operatives, men who were experts at blending into the urban landscape. Their instructions simple: locate the targets, observe, and wait for the signal to move in. Alistair wanted the key, and Corbin was a man who always delivered. Alistair himself was consumed by the preparations for his gala. He saw it as the ultimate act of reputation laundering. The unveiling of the Finch collection would cement his family's name not as corporate raiders, but as philanthropists, as guardians of culture and history. He walked through the grand hall of the Metropolitan Museum, barking orders at curators and event planners, his obsession with perfection bordering on mania. Every artifact, every lighting placement, every name on the guest list was personally scrutinized by him. He was building a fortress of public opinion, a grand stage upon which he would be celebrated as a modern-day Medici. He was so blinded by his own narrative, so convinced of his own impending triumph, that he was deaf to the rumblings of the earthquake that was about to shatter his world from its very foundations. His arrogance had become a shield, but it was a shield made of glass. Back in the safety of the university lab, the atmosphere was electric. Ilara laid the evidence out on the large steel table. The original ledgers next to the forged acquisition papers, the watermarked deeds, her great-grandfather's letter. Professor Blackwood and Marcus Thorne stared at the collection of documents, their expressions a mixture of awe and cold fury. It was more than they could have ever hoped for. It was a complete, irrefutable narrative of the crime, a story told in ink and paper that could not be denied. Marcus, the ruined archivist, ran a finger over the watermark, a single tear tracing a path down his weary face. It was the vindication he had been denied for a decade. The truth, buried for 60 years, was finally seeing the light. The plan for the final confrontation began to take shape, a strategy born from the combined intellect of the historian, the archivist, and the professor. They would not leak the story to a single journalist, who could be silenced or discredited. They would not file a lawsuit that would be buried in legal motions for years. They would follow Ilara's initial instinct and take the fight directly to Alistair's chosen battlefield. Professor Blackwood, as a respected member of the museum's board of trustees, had access to the gala's guest list and floor plans. Marcus Thorne, using his knowledge of Finch Global's corporate structure, identified the key investors and board members who would be in attendance, the people whose confidence was the very bedrock of Alistair's power. They would not just expose a man, they would dismantle an empire by showing its stakeholders that their entire enterprise was built on a foundation of sand. Ilara's role would be central. She would be the one to deliver the final blow. They began to prepare a presentation, a devastatingly simple side-by-side comparison of the real documents and the forgeries. They digitized the pages, highlighting the missing watermarks, the inconsistencies in the signatures, the fraudulent entries in the ledgers. They created a digital file, a poison pill, that could be uploaded to the museum's projection system. Ilara rehearsed her words, not a speech of anger, but a calm, factual, and utterly damning indictment. She would not present herself as a victim seeking revenge, but as a historian presenting her findings, an academic correcting a fraudulent entry in the public record. Her quiet authority, the very quality that had so unnerved Alistair in the restaurant, would be her most powerful weapon. The final piece of the puzzle was securing their own safety. They knew that once the presentation began, Alistair would react with all the fury and power he could command. Blackwood made a call to a trusted contact, a high-profile investigative journalist from the New York Times, known for her tenacity and integrity. He didn't give her the full story, only that a major revelation concerning corporate fraud was about to break at the Finch Gala, and that she should have her team ready. He also arranged for a copy of the evidence to be placed in a secure, third-party digital escrow, set to be released to every major news outlet in the world if anything were to happen to him, Ilara, or Marcus. It was their insurance policy, a dead man switch that guaranteed the truth would come out, no matter what Alistair tried to do. With 2 days to go until the gala, the plan was complete, the evidence was secured, the presentation was prepared, and the safety nets were in place. Ilara stood by the window of the lab, looking out at the city lights. In her hand, she held the van's key. It no longer felt like a burden, or even a weapon. It felt like an extension of herself, a symbol of the resilience and foresight that ran in her blood. She thought of her father, of the quiet dignity he had maintained even as his world was stolen from him. She was not just fighting for him now. She was fighting for every family that had been crushed by the ambition of men like Alistair Finch. The stage was set, the players were moving into their final positions, and the silent, invisible waitress from the gilded scepter was about to become the arbiter of a justice that was 60 years overdue. The final act was about to begin. The Temple of Dendur, housed within its own grand glass-walled sanctuary at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, was a stage set for gods and kings. Tonight, it served Alistair Finch. The ancient stone edifice, a relic of a fallen empire, was reflected perfectly in the still, dark water of the surrounding pool, a silent testament to the endurance of true power. A string quartet played softly in a corner, their music a delicate shimmering thread woven through the fabric of polite conversation and the clinking of champagne flutes. The air was thick, with the scent of night-blooming jasmine from the elaborate floral arrangements and the even more expensive perfumes worn by the city's elite. Men in perfectly tailored tuxedos and women draped in jewels that rivaled the constellations moved through the soft, strategic lighting with the practiced ease of a species comfortable at the apex of the food chain. Alistair Finch stood at the center of it all, a sun around which all these lesser planets orbited. He accepted congratulations, shook hands, and radiated a triumphant aura, the benevolent king presiding over his court, completely oblivious to the historical correction that was about to be made. He was celebrating his legacy, a legacy built on a foundation of lies, and tonight, the temple would bear witness to a new kind of judgment. Ilara's entrance was not an arrival, it was an infiltration, a quiet and deliberate breach of this hermetically sealed world of wealth. She wore a simple, elegant navy blue dress, a garment of such understated quality that it made the surrounding glitter and glamour seem almost garish in comparison. It was a uniform of a different kind, one that announced not subservience but a quiet, unshakable confidence. Her only piece of jewelry was the Vance key, resting against her collarbone not as an ornament but as a statement of intent, its intricate metal catching the light with a subtle, knowing gleam. Beside her, Professor Blackwood looked every bit the distinguished academic, his presence lending an immediate air of gravitas to their appearance. Ilara felt the stares, the curious, appraising glances that tried to place her in their rigid social hierarchy and failed. She met them not with defiance, but with a serene indifference. Her heart was a steady, rhythmic drum, her mind a calm, clear lake. In the reflection of the glass wall, she saw not a waitress, but the woman her father had always known she was, a scholar, a guardian, and now an avenger armed not with a sword, but with the truth. Alistair mounted the softly lit stage, stepping behind a sleek, minimalist lectern. A hush fell over the crowd, a wave of expectant silence. He smiled, a practiced, polished gesture that did not reach his cold, gray eyes. He began to speak, his voice smooth and resonant, amplified by the hidden speakers. He spoke of philanthropy, of cultural stewardship, of the profound responsibility that came with great wealth. He used words like synergy, and preservation, and legacy, weaving a narrative of his family as benevolent guardians of history, saviors of priceless artifacts that would otherwise have been lost to time. On the massive screen behind him, a slideshow began, displaying beautifully photographed images of the artifacts in the new Finch collection. Each object, he explained, told a story. He was a master storyteller, and his audience was completely captivated by the fiction he was spinning. Ilara watched him, her expression unreadable. She felt no anger, only a profound, almost clinical sense of pity for a man so lost in his own fabricated reality that he could no longer distinguish it from the truth. He was a forger not just of documents but of his own identity. As his speech reached its crescendo and the applause began to swell, Ilara moved. She did not rush. She walked with a deliberate, unhurried grace toward the front of the stage, her path clearing before her as people instinctively made way. She stopped directly below the lectern, waiting for the applause to die down. Alistair, basking in the adoration, finally saw her. The smile on his face froze, then curdled into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "Security!" he hissed into the microphone, his voice a venomous whisper that nonetheless carried through the silent hall. "Remove this woman. This is a disgruntled former employee with a history of delusion." His words were a desperate attempt to frame the narrative, to discredit her before she could even speak. But it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted. The audience, sensing a drama far more compelling than a prepared speech, leaned in, their eyes wide with anticipation. The serene atmosphere of the gala had been shattered, replaced by a tense, electric silence. The air itself seemed to crackle with the promise of a revelation. Ilara did not look at the security guards now cautiously approaching. She kept her eyes locked on Alistair, her gaze steady and unwavering. Her voice, when she spoke, needed no microphone. It was calm, clear, and carried to every corner of the vast room, a voice of pure, unshakable authority. "My name is Ilara Vance," she said, the name landing in the silent hall with the force of a physical blow. "And I am not a disgruntled employee, Mr. Finch. I am the historian you have the misfortune of having robbed." A wave of murmur swept through the crowd. Alistair's face went white. Before he could respond, Ilara gave a subtle nod to Marcus Thorne, who was positioned at the audio-visual controls at the back of the room. The screen behind Alistair flickered. The image of a priceless Grecian urn vanished, replaced by a split-screen display. On one side was a high-resolution image of a page from the original Vance ledger, its meticulous entries clear and precise. On the other side was the corresponding page from the forged acquisition document his grandfather had filed. The differences were stark, brutal, and undeniable. "For 60 years, Ilara's voice continued, a calm, precise narration accompanying the devastating visual evidence, the Finch family has built its legacy on a crime. The screen changed, now showing a close-up of an original Vance deed. My family, for generations, embedded a unique, cryptographic watermark into every significant document, a celestial chart keyed to the date of its creation. A red circle appeared on the screen, highlighting the faint, intricate pattern of the sextant and stars. It was our signature, our guarantee of authenticity." The image then shifted to the Finch acquisition deed. The space where the watermark should have been was empty, a blank space of damning absence. "A signature," Ilara said, her voice dropping slightly, imbued with a quiet, chilling finality, "that your grandfather, for all his cunning, was unable to forge." Gasps rippled through the audience. The flashes of cell phone cameras began to strobe, a frantic, silent storm capturing the public execution of a dynasty. Alistair Finch simply stared at the screen, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. The evidence was absolute, the logic inescapable. The truth he had spent his life ignoring, the dark secret at the heart of his family's fortune, was now projected 20 feet high for the entire world to see. The carefully constructed edifice of his life, his name, his legacy, was crumbling around him, turning to dust in the harsh, unforgiving light of historical fact. His face, which had been a mask of rage, now collapsed into a portrait of pure, abject horror. The blood drained from his features, leaving his skin a sickly, waxy gray. A low, guttural sound escaped his lips, a sound of an animal caught in a trap from which there is no escape. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to lie, but no words came out. His power, which had always been his voice, his influence, his name, had been rendered utterly meaningless. In that moment he was no longer a titan of industry. He was just the grandson of a common thief, exposed and shamed before the very people whose respect he craved most. Ilara took a final step forward, her movement drawing every eye in the room. She reached up and, with a quiet, deliberate gesture, unclasped the necklace from around her neck. She held it up, the Vance key resting in the palm of her hand, its intricate metal gleaming under the stage lights like a sacred relic. It seemed to pulse with a quiet, triumphant energy. She looked directly at Alistair, her eyes holding not triumph, but a deep, sorrowful pity. "You have spent a lifetime hunting for treasure, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice resonating with the weight of generations. "But you have never understood what true value is. You saw this as a key to a vault filled with gold. You were wrong." She held it higher for everyone to see. "This was never just a key to a vault. It is, and always has been, the key to the truth." The room was utterly silent, the weight of her final words settling over the crowd. Then, the chaos erupted. Journalists surged forward, shouting questions. Board members turned their backs on Alistair, their faces masks of cold fury. His world had not just ended, it had been erased. Type, justice, in the comments if you got chills when Ilara finally exposed the truth. In the months that followed, the Finch empire imploded with a speed and finality that was breathtaking. The evidence Elara presented was irrefutable, sparking immediate federal investigations into 60 years of corporate fraud, tax evasion, and racketeering. The Finch global name became synonymous with disgrace, its stock plummeting to worthlessness before the company was ultimately dismantled by regulators, its assets seized and liquidated. Alistair Finch, stripped of his wealth and his name, became a pariah, a tragic figure haunted by the ghost of a legacy he had never truly owned. The news cycles were filled with his downfall, a modern morality play about the inevitable collapse of a house built on lies. But Elara paid little attention to the spectacle. Her focus was on rebuilding, not on ruin. The courts, in a landmark ruling, restored the Vance family's patents and intellectual properties, their name finally cleared and their historical record corrected. Her great-grandfather's final wish had been fulfilled. Justice had been served not as a sword, but as a cleansing light. Elara did not return to the world of academia, nor did she retreat into the past. Her story had caught the attention of a rival investment firm, one founded on principles of ethical growth and historical preservation. A board member who had been in the audience that night, a woman deeply impressed by Elara's courage and brilliance, made her an offer she could not refuse: to create and lead a new division for cultural heritage and ethical acquisitions. Her new office was not on the 70th floor, nor did it overlook the park. It was a sunlit, book-lined space in a restored historic building, filled not with trophies of corporate conquest, but with artifacts being carefully researched and prepared for museum donation. She used her unique skills to identify and protect other small, family-owned heritage companies, becoming a shield against the very predators who had destroyed her own family. She had transformed her personal tragedy into a public service, ensuring that no other family would have their story stolen the way hers had been. Her greatest victory, however, was not professional, but personal. With the restored assets, she moved her father from the sterile, impersonal hospital to a world-class neurological care facility. A beautiful, serene place with gardens and sunlight. The best doctors, the best therapists, the best technology were now at his disposal. One afternoon, she sat by his bedside, reading to him from one of his old history books. He could not speak, but his eyes, once clouded by the fog of his condition, were clear and focused. He looked at her, and then his gaze shifted to the Vance key, which she now kept on a small table beside him. A faint smile touched his lips, and with a strength she had not seen in years, he reached out and squeezed her hand. In that simple, silent gesture, everything was said. He understood. He was proud. His legacy was safe. His honor and his dignity had been fully and completely restored. If Elara's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.